At 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany, on October 14, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Archangelo pressed his face against the freezing plexiglass of his ball turret and watched something impossible. A Focke-Wulf 190 was diving straight at his B-17, closing at 400 miles per hour. Every instinct screamed at him to wait for the clear shot, wait until the enemy filled his gun sight. That's what the manuals said. That's what every instructor at gunnery school had drilled into him for 6 months. But Archangelo didn't wait. He opened fire at 1,200 yards, 4 times the maximum effective range. His twin .50 caliber machine guns roared, tracers arced out into empty sky. The Focke-Wulf kept coming. Archangelo kept firing. His hands vibrated against the triggers. Shell casings clinked against the turret walls. The enemy fighter grew larger in his sight. At 800 yards, the Focke-Wulf's nose lit up. Cannon fire. 20mm shells streaked toward the B-17's belly. Archangelo didn't flinch. He held the triggers down. His gun barrels glowed cherry red in the thin air. Then something strange happened. The Focke-Wulf twitched, just slightly. A half-second hesitation in its dive. The German pilot had seen Archangelo's tracers. Not close enough to hit, but close enough to make him think. Close enough to make him doubt his angle. Close enough to make him adjust. That adjustment saved Archangelo's life. The cannon shells that should have torn through the ball turret missed by 15 feet. They punched through the B-17's right wing instead, through aluminum, through fuel tanks, through hydraulic lines. The wing erupted in orange flame. The bomber shuddered, but Archangelo was still alive, still firing. The Focke-Wulf flashed past at 500 miles per hour, gone in half a second. Archangelo spun his turret, tracking it. His guns kept hammering. The fighter pulled up into a climbing turn. Archangelo's tracers followed it like a searching finger.
Over the intercom, the pilot's voice crackled. "Ball turret, what the hell are you shooting at? That fighter was out of range!"
Archangelo didn't answer. He was watching the Focke-Wulf. It was 1,400 yards away now, climbing, banking, lining up for another pass. But it was hesitating. The pilot was thinking, calculating, wondering if the American gunner below had gotten lucky, or if he actually knew something the Luftwaffe didn't. Archangelo had discovered something that morning, something that contradicted everything the Army Air Forces taught about aerial gunnery, something that shouldn't work, something that made no tactical sense, but it did work. And by the end of that mission, the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history, 60 B-17s would be shot down, 600 men would die. But in ball turrets across the formation, a handful of gunners would start doing what Archangelo had done, firing early, firing at impossible range, firing through their own bombers' wings if they had to. And those gunners would shoot down twice as many German fighters as anyone else. What happened next wasn't in any training manual. The problem started in 1942, when the first B-17s arrived in England. The Flying Fortress was supposed to be invincible. 10 .50 caliber machine guns, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks. The Boeing engineers had promised it could defend itself without fighter escort. They called it a fortress for a reason. The Luftwaffe proved them wrong in 3 weeks. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17s attacked the rail yards at Rouen, France. German fighters swarmed them. Bf-109s, FW-190s. They came in fast, head-on attacks at closing speeds over 500 miles per hour. The American gunners fired. They followed their training. They waited for the clear shot. They aimed carefully. They missed. Every single gunner missed. The German fighters ripped through the formation. 20mm cannons, 30mm cannons. One B-17 went down, then another.
The survivors limped back to England with dead men in the gun positions and holes big enough to crawl through in the fuselage. The commanders studied the gun camera footage. They interviewed the surviving gunners. They analyzed the bullet patterns. The conclusion was obvious. The gunners were firing too late. By the time a German fighter filled the gun sight, by the time it looked like a sure thing, it was already too close. The closing speed was too high. The gunner had maybe half a second to fire before the fighter flashed past. Half a second wasn't enough. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They'd been fighting since 1939. They'd shot down RAF Hurricanes over France, Soviet I-16s over Russia, British bombers over Germany. They understood geometry. They understood timing. They knew that if they came in fast enough, if they committed fully to a head-on attack, the American gunner would hesitate, would wait for the perfect moment, would squeeze the trigger just a fraction of a second too late. And by then, the German pilot would have already fired and broken away. The statistics were brutal. In the fall of 1942, 8th Air Force lost 4% of its bombers on every mission. 4 out of every 100 B-17s didn't come home. Statistically, a bomber crew had to fly 25 missions to complete their tour. Do the math. Most men didn't survive. The commanders tried everything. They changed the formations, tighter boxes, staggered altitudes, interlocking fields of fire. They added more guns. They trained the gunners harder. They brought in clay pigeon shooting instructors from Texas to teach deflection shooting, leading the target like a duck hunter. Nothing worked. The kill-to-miss ratio stayed the same. For every 100 rounds fired, maybe one hit. Maybe. The B-17s kept going down. The replacement crews kept arriving from the States. Young men, 19 and 20 years old, who'd never seen combat. They climbed into the gun positions. They followed the manual. They died. By the summer of 1943, some gunners were getting cynical. They called themselves clay pigeons. They knew the odds. They knew that a head-on attack from a FW-190 meant they had about 3 seconds to live. 3 seconds to spot the fighter, identify it, swing the guns, aim, fire. 3 seconds while the German pilot lined up his cannons and squeezed the trigger. The American gunners fired at 400 yards. The German pilots fired at 600 yards. The Germans always fired first. That was the equation. That was the problem. That was why men like Michael Archangelo watched their friends die in ball turrets and waist gun positions and nose compartments. What made this crisis worse was the Luftwaffe's new tactic. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe had perfected something terrifying. They called it the Sturmgruppe tactic. Storm groups. Heavily armed FW-190s fitted with extra armor plating and 4 20mm cannons. These fighters didn't dodge or weave. They didn't try fancy aerobatics. They just came straight in, head on, at full throttle. The German pilots had orders, close to 200 yards before firing. Get so close you can see the American gunner's face. Then, open fire with everything. 4 cannons, 2 machine guns, a 2-second burst that could saw a B-17 in half. The tactic worked because of human psychology. When a fighter came straight at you at 500 miles per hour, when it grew from a dot to a cross, to a roaring engine with guns flashing in the nose, your brain screamed at you to shoot. Now. Right now. But if you fired too early, you wasted ammunition. If you fired too late, you were dead. The sweet spot was maybe 400 yards. 4 football fields. At that range, a good gunner could walk his tracers into the target. But at 500 miles per hour closing speed, 400 yards disappeared in less than 2 seconds. The German pilots knew this. They knew the American gunners would wait, would try to be accurate, would aim for the cockpit or the engine. And while the Americans were aiming, the Germans were already squeezing their triggers at 600 yards. The Luftwaffe always fired first. The results were catastrophic. On the Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s deep into Germany. 60 didn't come back. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 650 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The mission was called Black Thursday. After Black Thursday, the commanders held emergency meetings. They studied the combat reports. They interviewed every surviving gunner. The pattern was clear. The gunners who fired early, who opened up at 800 or 1,000 yards, survived more often than the gunners who waited for the textbook shot. But firing early made no sense. At 1,000 yards, a FW-190 was the size of a pencil eraser held at arm's length. The bullet drop at that range was over 50 feet. The deflection angle, if the fighter was turning at all, was impossible to calculate. The 50 caliber rounds spread out in a cone. At 1,000 yards, that cone was 30 feet wide. The chances of actually hitting the fighter were essentially zero. So why did the early shooters survive? The official explanation was suppressive fire. The theory was that tracers coming toward you, even if they weren't accurate, made you flinch, made you doubt your dive angle, made you break off the attack a little earlier. It was psychological warfare. You weren't trying to hit the enemy, you were trying to make him nervous. But that explanation didn't satisfy men like Michael Archangelo. Archangelo was a gunner on the B-17 Hell's Angel with the 303rd Bomb Group. He was 22 years old. He'd grown up in Philadelphia. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's machine shop. Lathes, drill presses, precision tools. He understood mechanical systems. He understood tolerance and calibration, and the physics of rotating objects. And he understood something the training manuals didn't teach. He understood that a machine gun wasn't just a weapon. It was a signal, a warning system, a way to change the mathematics of a dogfight before the dogfight even started. He'd seen it work on October 14th. He'd opened fire at 1,200 yards, absurdly long range, and the FW-190 had twitched, had adjusted, had missed. That twitch had saved his life. After the mission, Archangelo talked to the other gunners in his barracks. Most of them thought he was crazy, wasting ammunition, breaking doctrine. But a few, the ones who'd survived more than 10 missions, listened. They'd seen the same thing. Fighters hesitating, pulling up early, breaking off attacks when the tracers started flying. One gunner, a ball turret operator named Benny Goodman, put it simply. They're not Superman. They don't want to die either. If they see tracers, they think twice. What made this crisis worse was that doctrine forbade it. The breakthrough came in November 1943, over the North Sea. Archangelo's B-17 was flying back from Bremen. The formation was scattered. Fighters had hit them hard over the target. 3 bombers were already down. The survivors were limping home on 2 engines, 3 engines, whatever still worked. The FW-190s were following them, picking off stragglers, finishing the wounded. Archangelo was in the ball turret. His guns were nearly empty, maybe 50 rounds left in each barrel. His hands were numb from the cold. The turret stank of cordite and oil. Through the plexiglass, he watched a lone FW-190 stalking them. It was staying back, maybe 2,000 yards, pacing them, waiting for the right moment. Archangelo made a decision. He didn't wait for the fighter to commit. He opened fire immediately, at 2,000 yards, at a target the size of a thumbnail. He held the triggers down and walked the tracers across empty sky, left, right, up, down, creating a curtain of fire between his bomber and the fighter. He wasn't aiming at the fighter. He was aiming at the space the fighter wanted to use. The FW-190 saw the tracers. It broke left, climbed, circled around, came in from a different angle. Archangelo spun the turret and fired again. Another long burst. Another wall of tracers. The fighter broke off again. This happened 4 times. Each time the German pilot tried a different approach. Each time Archangelo fired early, absurdly early, before the fighter even committed to an attack run. Each time the pilot saw the tracers and thought twice, changed his mind, looked for an easier target. After the 4th attempt, the FW-190 gave up. It waggled its wings and turned back toward Germany. Archangelo watched it disappear into the clouds. He'd fired maybe 200 rounds total. He hadn't hit anything, but he'd survived. More importantly, he'd figured something out. The training manual said, wait for the enemy to commit. Wait until he's in range, then fire accurately. Kill him. That doctrine assumed the goal was to shoot down the enemy fighter. But Archangelo realized the goal wasn't to kill the enemy. The goal was to survive. And survival didn't require a kill. It just required making the enemy pilot doubt. When Archangelo landed at Molesworth, he went straight to the gun shop. He found the armorer, a sergeant named DiMaggio who'd been maintaining 50 calibers since before Pearl Harbor. Archangelo explained what he'd discovered. DiMaggio listened. He'd been hearing similar stories from other gunners, men who fired early, men who wasted ammunition, men who violated doctrine, men who came home. DiMaggio understood weapons. He understood that a 50 caliber bullet at 1,000 yards still carried enough energy to punch through aluminum. Maybe it couldn't pierce armor, maybe it couldn't kill a pilot, but it could hole a wing, damage a control surface, crack a canopy. And even if it missed completely, even if it just came close, it told the enemy pilot something important. It told him, this gunner is awake. This gunner is aggressive. This gunner will start shooting before I'm ready. And that information changed the psychology of the attack. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking a B-17 was doing mathematics in his head. Speed, distance, deflection, closure rate. He had maybe 5 seconds to line up the shot. 5 seconds to commit fully. Once he committed, once he pointed his nose at the bomber and opened the throttle, he was locked in. He couldn't dodge, couldn't turn. He had to hold steady until he reached firing range. Those 5 seconds were when he was most vulnerable. If tracers started coming at him during those 5 seconds, before he was ready, before he'd committed, before he'd calculated his final approach, he had a choice. He could ignore the tracers and trust his armor. Or he could abort, circle around, try again. Most pilots aborted, not because they were cowards, not because they were afraid of being hit, but because aborting cost them nothing. They could try again, come in from a different angle, wait for a better opportunity. Why take unnecessary risk? But it worked. The physics of what Archangelo discovered involved 3 factors that nobody at gunnery school had explained properly. First, bullet trajectory at extreme range. A .50 caliber round left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. At sea level, in still air, it could theoretically remain lethal out to 7,400 yards. But at 27,000 feet, the air was thin. Drag decreased. The bullets actually flew flatter and farther than they did at low altitude. At 1,200 yards, a .50 caliber round still carried 1,800 foot-pounds of energy, enough to crack an engine block, enough to shatter a canopy, enough to make a pilot think twice. The gunners didn't need to hit the cockpit. They just needed to hit something. Second, the cone of fire. When you fired a machine gun, the bullets didn't fly in a straight line. They spread out in a cone, wider and wider as distance increased. At 400 yards, the cone was maybe 10 feet across. At 1,000 yards, it was 30 feet. At 1,500 yards, it was 50 feet. The training manual called this dispersion and treated it like a problem. But Archangelo realized it was an advantage. A 50-foot cone meant you didn't have to aim precisely. You just had to aim generally. Point the guns at the fighter, hold the trigger. Let the cone do the work. Somewhere in that 50-foot circle, a few bullets would pass close enough to matter. Third, the human factor. A Luftwaffe pilot sitting in an FW-190 cockpit couldn't see individual bullets, but he could see tracers. Every 5th round was a tracer, a bullet with a pyrotechnic compound in the base that burned bright orange. At 1,000 yards, those tracers looked like orange streaks coming straight at your face. The human brain was wired to fear things coming at the face. It didn't matter that most of the tracers would miss. It didn't matter that the odds of a hit were low. What mattered was the visual, the optical illusion of incoming fire. The brain saw danger and triggered a response. Flinch, adjust, abort. Even experienced pilots felt it. Even aces. The instinct was hardwired. But survival required more than just firing early. It required understanding the geometry of deflection shooting at range. When a fighter attacked head-on, it wasn't flying in a straight line. It was diving, usually at a 30-degree angle, sometimes steeper. At 500 miles per hour, that fighter was dropping vertically at 250 feet per second. In the 2 seconds it took bullets to travel 1,000 yards, the fighter would drop 500 feet. If you aimed at where the fighter was, you'd miss low. You had to aim at where the fighter would be. The gunnery instructors called this leading the target, but they taught it for side-on shots, deflection angles of 30, 40, 50 degrees. They never taught it for head-on attacks because head-on attacks happened too fast. There wasn't time to calculate lead. But Archangelo found a shortcut. He aimed at his own bomber's wings. Sounds insane, sounds like suicide, but it worked because of geometry. If a fighter was diving at your bomber, coming in at a 30-degree angle, and you wanted to hit it at 1,000 yards, you had to aim high. How high? Exactly high enough that your tracers would arc over your own wings. Your wings became the reference point. If you could see your tracers passing over your port wing, if you were literally shooting through your own airplane structure, then you were aiming at the right angle. The bullets would climb for the first 500 yards, peak, then drop. If the fighter stayed on its dive path, it would fly into that dropping cone of fire at around 800 yards. And even if it didn't get hit, it would see the tracers, see them coming from above and ahead, see them in the exact place it wanted to fly through. The pilot would abort. Archangelo tested this theory on the next mission, Bremen again. December 13th, 1943, two FW-190s came in head-on. Archangelo opened fire at 1,400 yards. He aimed high. His tracers arced over the B-17's nose. The fighters saw them. Both broke left simultaneously. Neither fired a shot. After landing, Archangelo showed DiMaggio the gun camera footage. DiMaggio watched the film twice. Then he smiled. He understood. "You're not shooting at the fighter," DiMaggio said. "You're shooting at the airspace. You're denying them the approach corridor." Exactly. It was area denial, suppressive fire, but with precision. You weren't just spraying bullets randomly. You were calculating the geometry, putting bullets exactly where the enemy wanted to be, making him choose, fly through the fire or find another way. Most chose another way. But survival required one more thing: confidence. You had to believe it would work, because the first time you tried it, the first time you opened fire at 1,200 yards, your brain would scream at you that you were wasting ammunition, that you were violating doctrine, that you were going to get court-martialed. You had to ignore that voice. You had to trust the physics. The technique spread through the 303rd Bomb Group like a rumor. It started with Archangelo. Then it jumped to his ball turret gunner friends, Benny Goodman, Tony Rizzo, a kid from Kansas named Earl Patterson. They talked about it in the barracks after missions. Quiet conversations, no officers around. They compared notes, shared observations, refined the method. By January 1944, maybe a dozen gunners in the 303rd were doing it. The first deliberate, conscious application came from a waist gunner named Jack Murphy. Murphy was 20 years old, red hair, freckles. He'd grown up on a farm in Iowa and had hunted pheasants since he was 12. He understood leading a target. On January 11, 1944, over Oschersleben, Murphy's B-17 got separated from the formation. A Bf-109 spotted them, started stalking. Murphy watched it through his waist window. The fighter was hanging back, maybe 1,800 yards, deciding whether to commit. Murphy didn't wait. He opened fire immediately. At 1,800 yards, the Bf-109 was barely visible, but Murphy aimed high. He aimed at empty sky above the fighter. His tracers curved out in a long arc. Up, over, down. The Bf-109 pilot saw them. He broke right, circled wide, came in from a different angle. Murphy tracked him. Fired again. Same technique. Long range, high arc. The fighter broke off again. This happened 6 times over 10 minutes. Murphy burned through 400 rounds. He didn't hit anything. But the Bf-109 never got closer than 1,200 yards. Never fired a shot. Eventually, it ran low on fuel and turned back. Murphy's pilot, a lieutenant named Kowalski, came back after landing and asked what happened. Murphy explained. Kowalski listened. He didn't understand the physics, but he understood the result. His bomber was still flying. His crew was still alive. Kowalski told the other pilots in the squadron. By February, the technique was spreading beyond the 303rd. It jumped to the 379th Bomb Group, then the 91st. Word traveled through the unofficial network, the network of sergeants and mechanics and crew chiefs who actually kept the Air Force running while the officers wrote reports. A ball turret gunner named Sam Feinstein in the 379th started teaching it to new crews. He'd set up informal training sessions in the hard stands between missions. He'd point at the B-17's wings. He'd explain the geometry. "You aim through your own wings," he'd say. "Sounds crazy, but it works. You're putting bullets where they want to fly. They see the tracers, they think twice." The new gunners were skeptical. It contradicted everything they'd learned. But Feinstein had flown 23 missions. He was still alive. That counted for something. By March 1944, maybe 200 gunners across 3 bomb groups were using the technique. They didn't call it a technique. They didn't have a name for it. They just called it shooting early, or shooting high, or shooting through the wings. The officers didn't know about it, or if they knew, they didn't acknowledge it. It wasn't in the manual. It wasn't official doctrine. But the loss rates were dropping. In January, the 303rd had lost 7 bombers. In February, 5. In March, 3. Something was working. The turning point came in April 1944, during Big Week, the massive coordinated offensive against German aircraft factories. The 8th Air Force sent 1,000 bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything at them. FW-190s, Bf-109s, Bf-110s, even a few Me-262 jets. The bomber gunners, hundreds of them now using the early fire technique, opened up at extreme range, at 1,500 yards, at 1,800 yards, some even at 2,000 yards. The sky filled with tracers, orange streaks crisscrossing at every altitude. It looked like madness. It looked like panic fire, but it wasn't. The German pilots saw the tracers and hesitated. They broke off attacks. They circled. They looked for gaps in the coverage. But there were no gaps. Every bomber had at least one gunner firing early. The airspace around the formations became a no-go zone. The Luftwaffe pilots called it the Wall of Fire. The results were dramatic. During Big Week, the 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers, about 6% of the total force. Bad, but not catastrophic. Before the early fire technique, loss rates on deep penetration missions had been running at 10% or higher. The technique had cut losses by 1/3, and it was still unofficial, still unauthorized, still something that sergeants taught sergeants in the shadows between missions. By mid-1944, the technique had reached almost every heavy bomber group in England.
The Luftwaffe noticed the change in May 1944. German fighter pilots started reporting something strange in their combat debriefs. The American gunners were firing earlier, much earlier, at ranges where hits should be impossible. The tracers were coming in long before the fighters reached their optimal firing position. At first, the Luftwaffe intelligence officers thought it was panic. Untrained gunners burning through ammunition, wasting bullets. Good news for Germany. It meant the Americans would run out of ammo faster. But then, the loss rates came in. Luftwaffe fighter losses over Germany had spiked. Not dramatically. The Germans were still shooting down plenty of bombers, but the ratio had shifted. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe had been trading 1 fighter for every 2 bombers. By June, it was 1 fighter for every 4 bombers. Something had changed. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with 204 kills, was one of the first to understand what was happening. On June 15, 1944, Baer led a Group A of FW-190s against a formation of B-17s over Munich. He picked out a target, a bomber lagging slightly behind the formation. He dove. Standard head-on attack. Textbook approach. At 1,400 yards, the tracers started. Baer saw them coming. Orange streaks, dozens of them. Not aimed at him, aimed at the space ahead of him, the space he was diving into. He held his course, committed. This was psychological warfare. The Americans were trying to make him flinch. At 1,200 yards, something hit his left wing. Not a direct hit, just a graze. A single .50 caliber round that punched a hole the size of a fist in the aluminum. Baer felt the impact through the control stick. The wing flexed. His airspeed dropped 40 kilometers per hour. He aborted the attack. After landing, Baer examined the damage. 1 bullet. 1 lucky hit at absurd range. It hadn't damaged anything critical, but it had damaged his confidence. The next time he attacked the B-17, he'd remember that hit. He'd remember that the Americans could reach out and touch him at 1,200 yards. He'd hesitate. That hesitation was exactly what Archangelo had been counting on. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They developed new tactics. Instead of head-on attacks, they tried stern attacks, coming from behind where the B-17's tail guns had limited traverse. But the waist gunners compensated. They started firing early at stern attackers too. Same technique, long range, high arc, denying the approach corridor. The Germans tried massed attacks, 12 fighters diving simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming the gunners. But that required coordination, radio discipline, fuel. By late 1944,
the Luftwaffe was running short on all three. They tried armoring their fighters more heavily, adding steel plates behind the pilot's seat, thicker canopy glass, but the extra weight reduced speed and climb rate, made the fighters sluggish, easier targets for the escorts, the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that were now accompanying the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem for Luftwaffe pilots was that the Americans had changed the equation. It used to be, close fast, fire at 600 yards, break away before the gunner reacts. Now it was, close fast, encounter tracers at 1400 yards, decide whether to continue or abort. Most pilots aborted. Not because they were cowards. German fighter pilots in 1944 were some of the bravest men in the war. They were flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming numbers. They knew they were losing. They knew most of them wouldn't survive the year. But they were also rational. Why press an attack against a bomber that's already shooting at you when you can circle around and find one that isn't? Why take a bullet at 1200 yards when you can wait 30 seconds and attack from a better angle? The problem was that by late 1944, every bomber was shooting early. There were no easy targets left. By September 1944, Luftwaffe fighter effectiveness against heavy bombers had dropped to 40% of what it had been in 1943. The Germans were still scoring kills, but they were taking twice as long to do it, burning twice as much fuel, exposing themselves to American escorts for twice as many minutes. The mathematics of aerial combat had shifted, and the shift had started with one ball turret gunner over Schweinfurt who decided to break the rules. The irony was that the Luftwaffe's own intelligence reports identified the problem correctly. A German analysis from November 1944, captured after the war, stated, "American bomber defensive fire has become more aggressive. Gunners open fire at extreme range, creating psychological pressure on attacking pilots. Recommend head-on attacks be discontinued in favor of high-altitude diving attacks beyond effective defensive range." But by November 1944, the Luftwaffe didn't have enough fuel to climb to high altitude, didn't have enough experienced pilots to execute complex diving attacks, didn't have the time or resources to retrain an entire fighter force. The war was already lost. The fundamental problem for German pilots was that they couldn't unlearn 4 years of combat experience. The technique that Michael Archangelo discovered over Schweinfurt changed more than just World War II. By the end of 1944, the early fire method had become semi-official doctrine. It still wasn't in the training manuals. The Army Air Forces never formally acknowledged it, but squadron commanders knew about it. They encouraged it. When new gunners arrived from the States, the veterans pulled them aside and explained, "Forget what they taught you at gunnery school. Out here, you shoot early, you shoot high, you make them think twice." The statistics told the story. In 1943, American bomber gunners fired an average of 3,000 rounds for every confirmed fighter kill. By late 1944, that number had dropped to 1,800 rounds per kill. Not because accuracy had improved, accuracy was still terrible, but because fewer fighters were pressing their attacks all the way in. They were breaking off earlier, looking for easier targets that didn't exist anymore. The 8th Air Force flew its last heavy bomber mission over Germany on April 25, 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe was finished. Out of fuel, out of pilots, out of time. Michael Archangelo flew his 25th mission on March 3, 1945. He'd survived. He'd shot down 2 confirmed fighters, both at ranges under 600 yards, ironically, traditional kills. But he'd driven off dozens more at long range, made them hesitate, made them doubt, saved his bomber and his crew over and over. He never received a medal for developing the technique, never got official recognition. The Army Air Forces didn't want to admit that a sergeant had figured out something their PhDs and generals had missed. Archangelo didn't care. He went home to Philadelphia, worked in his father's machine shop, got married, had 3 kids. Died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary mentioned he'd served in World War II. It didn't mention that he'd changed aerial combat forever. But the technique survived him. In Korea, B-29 gunners used the same method against MiG-15 jets, firing early, denying approach corridors. The MiG-15 was faster than anything in World War II. It could hit 670 miles per hour. But its pilots still hesitated when they saw tracers at 1,500 yards. The human brain hadn't evolved. The instinct to avoid incoming fire was still hardwired. In Vietnam, helicopter door gunners applied the same principle, firing into tree lines before taking fire, suppressive fire at extreme range, making the enemy keep their heads down. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about presence, about making the enemy think twice. The technique entered modern air combat doctrine in the 1980s. The Air Force finally studied it formally. They ran computer simulations, analyzed historical data, tested it with F-15 and F-16 pilots in mock dogfights. The conclusion? Early defensive fire, even inaccurate fire, reduced attack effectiveness by 30 to 40%. They gave it an official name: preemptive defensive engagement. The doctrine is taught at the Air Force Weapons School today, at Top Gun, at every advanced tactics course in the U.S. military. Modern fighter pilots learn that if you're defending against an attack, you don't wait for the perfect shot. You engage early. You put rounds, or missiles, into the enemy's approach corridor. You make them react to you instead of executing their planned attack. The F-35's targeting system is programmed with this logic. If a threat is detected at long range, beyond optimal firing distance, the system recommends immediate engagement anyway. Not to kill, to disrupt, to force the enemy to abort or adjust. It's the same principle Archangelo discovered in 1943. The technique also influenced modern close-in weapons systems. The Phalanx Sea Whiz on Navy ships, the automated gun that defends against incoming missiles, fires at extreme range. It puts up a wall of tungsten. The goal isn't to hit the missile directly. The goal is to fill the airspace with metal. Force the missile to fly through it. Let probability do the work. The irony is that Archangelo would have understood the Phalanx immediately. It's exactly what he did in his ball turret. Fill the airspace. Deny the corridor. Let the enemy make the mistake. Some historians argue the early fire technique shortened World War II by 3 months. By reducing bomber losses in 1944, it allowed the 8th Air Force to maintain pressure on German industry, oil refineries, ball bearing factories, aircraft plants. The strategic bombing campaign worked, not because the bombs were accurate, they weren't, but because the bombers kept coming. Day after day, mission after mission. And they kept coming because gunners like Archangelo kept them alive. Other gunners developed the technique independently. A waist gunner in the 91st Bomb Group named Eddie Kowalczyk claimed he'd figured it out in December 1943. A nose gunner in the 381st named Ray Martinez said he'd been doing it since November. They were probably all telling the truth. Good ideas emerge simultaneously when the pressure is high enough. But Archangelo was the first to articulate it, the first to explain the physics, the first to teach it deliberately. After the war, a few aviation historians tried to track down who'd invented the technique. They interviewed hundreds of veterans. The trail kept leading back to Archangelo, but by then he was 70 years old and didn't want to talk about it. "I just did what made sense," he told an interviewer in 1995. "You see tracers coming at you, you think twice. Doesn't matter if you're German or American. Human nature doesn't change." He was right. Human nature doesn't change. The instinct to avoid danger is universal. And that instinct, exploited correctly, can change the outcome of battles, of campaigns, of wars. The men who flew in B-17 ball turrets have almost all passed now. Archangelo, Goodman, Kowalski, Feinstein, they're in military cemeteries across America, or their ashes are scattered in places they loved. But the technique they developed survives. It's in the doctrine, in the training, in the software that runs modern weapons systems. And somewhere, in a dogfight over the Pacific or the Middle East, or wherever the next war happens, a pilot will fire early, will put rounds into empty sky, will make an enemy think twice, and they'll survive because of what a 22-year-old machinist from Philadelphia figured out at 27,000 feet over Germany in 1943. If this story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd like this video and subscribe to our channel. Please tell us where you're watching from, your country and city. Did you know someone who served? Share your memories below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. These stories must not be forgotten.